Well, thank you for this opportunity to present to you all, not coming to you live, but coming to you virtually from my living room. My presentation here today is titled Vocational Imperialism, Building a Culturally Relevant Workforce in Indonesia. And I'd like to just explain a little bit about who I am. I've lived and worked in Indonesia and Timor and Australia on human capability development programs for government, donors, multilateral and bilateral donors, and industry for over 3 decades. And I've advised the Minister for Education and Training in Timor-Leste on the development of a polytechnic across the country of Timor. And I've managed and administered many Australian government development programs over a life of maybe 15 years working for a university in Melbourne. My recent writing, and I've put them up on the screen now, is about examining the impact that we as donors and as foreigners have had in the countries that we've been involved in. So I draw your reference to those texts. My current role is that I am the chair of the Asean Institute of Applied Learning. And in this institute, we are looking at the building capacity with local training practitioners in terms of improving existing practice. But one of the areas of conversation here today is going to examine the relationship, the importance, the relevance of the foreigner in our midst. And that's what's under investigation. The foreigner in an Indonesian context is the bule. Now, so the bule is the Indonesian word for foreigner and is often referenced as it's often the white male. It's about the attitude that Indonesians bestow on the person called the bule. And their attitude is assigning honour and respect toward a foreigner. And this, by implication, there's a valuing of the foreigner engagement in the country when we're looking at training interventions. And this valuing foreign involvement means that locally skilled workers are overlooked. And so capacity building opportunities are foregone because of the presence of the foreigner, which therefore reaffirms the need for continued foreign intervention. I've titled this The Self-Fulfilling Prophecy of Bule Dependence, and you can find that in Looking for a Way Out 2018. Now, it's important to begin to work on the language of, well, how do we get there? Language positions us within our communities. And so when we say, of course, we are acknowledging that we are included as part of a community. And when you say, of course, you are engaging with and recognizing ownership and sense of community. So when people use language like girls like pink or boys play with guns, oh, don't worry, of course boys play with guns. We are, at those points, not unpacking what it is that makes the word of course in that regard. Of course, Australians value mateship, and perhaps we need to begin to question that. Of course, film villains wear black, and there's sound that is associated with that dark film noir activity. Stuart Hall from the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies is the person who I credit for this examination of this language. He was the person who introduced the concept of aha. And aha, when you say aha, you're being your most ideological. That's Stuart Hall's work. And aha is the same as of course. Of course, gurus are esteemed members of our communities. Now, when we start to unpack this word, of course, in an Indonesian cultural context, yes, of course, gurus are highly esteemed and highly valued. Gurus is the Indonesian word for teacher. So when we say that, when we look at that, we say, oh, that's okay when we use the word guru. But if we switched it around and said teachers are highly esteemed members of our community, it begins to not resonate so well when you specifically maybe look at an Australian community, or you look at another Western community and the value they place on teaching and teaching practice. If we examine TVET interventions, we can see that we're exporting TVET systems into foreign countries, and the examples you could use are the national qualifications frameworks that are begin to be designed in Western countries and then are substituted into foreign NUSANT developing country context and say, oh, here is a system, why don't you use this? Of course, it works in Australia and other Western countries, but does it work well in the countries where it's being imposed? Demand-driven TVET systems. This is the language that we see coming from the multilateral donors. We need to have demand-driven TVET systems without a question. It's relevant in advanced communities, but how relevant is it in a post-conflict community where it's a rural community and industry and trade is not present? And rural communities, we'll be beginning to unpack this notion of course, demand-driven training systems are relevant. They carry with them culturally laden educational practices that belong in the West and are being imposed in a development context. Unpack this language. We carry this language like a baggage in our daily lives without ever questioning the authenticity of the language. So employer inputs are just one voice in the conversation of from student and perspective. It's not the only perspective. Employer inputs, national uniform standards are definable goals. However, how agile are they and how innovative and how do they respond to local needs? Industry-led occupational standards are relevant in some communities, but as I've indicated just a while ago, how relevant are they in rural and traditional forms of vet development? The Indonesian, now, when I look at this, we start to say, of course, capacity building requires technical know-how from the West. And in that context, William Eastley's work in White Man's Burden talks around the need for searchers rather than responders. We need to support on the ground activity in the countries at which we are trying to build capacity rather than rely on the technical know-how from the West. It's a very important and a great piece of text that has implications for the way in which we look at vocational training interventions across Indonesia and other ASEAN countries. Of course, we can say, of course, concepts of inclusivity, how applicable are they in an ASEAN context? where it's particularly value-laden and value-driven. We have the situation where, well, to what extent is vocational skills development leads to growth? To what extent do we need? Is that the truth? How are we going to measure that? We need to develop ways and means to confront these messages. And so, are useful. And again, I go back to Stuart Hall's work in relation to this. We need ways of decoding the messages that come to us. What is not included is equally valued as what is included. When we ask who or what is not included, we can begin to interpret the position or the target for the activity. Well, let's examine how this works. Well, it's not who is included in the strategic partnership that matters. It's also who is not included in the partnership. Being left off the invitation list for a strategic retreat for an organisation says something about, you know, what value is being placed on your input. The notion of picking winners is the example here, where I have an example, personal experience of the Asian Development Bank in Timor-Leste with their mid-level skills development program, where they chose building an automotive as an activity of vocational education and training against the wishes of the government of Timor-Leste. So we need to examine whether this is an appropriate response. We also need to similarly question the language of demand-driven TVET systems from our advanced communities, which may have little applicability in rural and conflict communities. Of course, occupational standard is selected for industry inclusion. It is also what occupational standard is not selected for inclusion that matter. So even the notion of exploring what ought to be included when you're developing standards for industry says something about, well, what reference that might assist current need, but how does it impact on future need? And finally, which participants are included is as much as important as which participants are not included. Now, in that regard, we only have to look at the high level of people of disadvantage and who are discriminated against, who are not part of the conversations around program development. Well, how do we lead towards meaningful engagement? How do we manage meaningful engagement? This issue is around addressing the ethical issues of our behaviour. So our ethical behaviour begins by reviewing the motivations behind our actions. What this action is and what is not. Why was this justification for the approach? What alternative exists for achieving the same result? The questions that we need to ask are, how were the decisions made to determine the planned intervention? And who was involved in determining the planned intervention? What were the planned outcomes? And how were these outcomes described and determined? What rationale exists for determining who the partners are when we're looking at any particular activity? And how was the rationale you determined for who those partners were? All of these ethical issues reflect what our intentions and our objectives are for any of our vocational education and training interventions. So we need to begin to ask, be prepared to ask difficult and challenging questions to all stakeholders, including government, including donors, and including civil society. In defining intentions and objectives, practitioners, government, industry, donors need to establish good frameworks for evaluation frameworks at the beginning in order to test the validity of those objectives. We need to look at how we acknowledge and recognise recipient country ownership. Some recipient countries develop strategic plans, and these are where we are able to pin our training priorities against. And this will assist educational practitioners match their training offerings. We need to look at what engagement we have with government in these recipient countries. We need to look at searches on the ground, those people that are linked to what local needs are. And we need to look at the way in which we have a requirement for sustainability in vocational education and training. And this requires cross-cultural skills in partnering and working with institutions and organisations on the ground in country. And then we need to look at program interventions where we're sharing program interventions. Now, this I'm articulating is where we might position a notion of meaningful engagement. And I've put together a model which reflects this. I've titled it the Meaningful Practice Intervention Model, and you'll find it in Looking for a Way Out 2018. But it also, it's a reflection of what I've just indicated, articulating intentions, examining methods and evaluation techniques, looking at stakeholder requirements, and that's how government and donors ought to look at their practice. It is equally relevant in an industry and civil society way, where we look at what the industry expectations are, then the acceptance of the industry outcomes, and finally we need another meaningful recognition of local needs, and this requires that we look for evidence that we are communicating at the local level, and evidence that we're sharing what we find. The way this model works is that if we follow these paths, we may get to a part of meaningful practice intervention. Well, that's my presentation, and I have some closing remarks to make regarding acknowledge when we're being our most ideological. Remember, the use of our language, of course, or aha. Recognise that is when we are being our most ideological, and then develop strategies to unpack that. And I've presented one particular strategy that works well in an education and training context. Then we need to design programs based on local needs and develop skills to engage participants in the learning process. We need to reach agreement on what our evaluation methods would be, and importantly, harness cross-cultural needs by including strategies that can achieve this. Share our program outcomes and challenge the language of and the relevance of the Bulle. My thanks for listening to me today, and you'll find more information can be found on our Asean Institute of Applied Learning website, www.aial.institute. Thank you.